75 years on, remembering the Coniston bus train tragedy.
As always, my name is Cody. Welcome or welcome back to the Case Files, Minds of Madness. A quick reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories told by yours truly. Now grab a snack and a blanket, and let's dive in.
The bus-train collision that claimed 9 lives and injured 32 others occurred at approximately 8:15 a.m. on Friday, February 9th, 1951, at the Canadian Pacific Railway level crossing in Coniston. It was the worst tragedy to strike the Sudbury district in many years, and the most devastating event in Coniston's history. Weather conditions were extreme. Witnesses reported temperatures reaching 47 degrees below zero, the coldest in 18 years. Frost hung thickly in the air as the heavily laden bus approached the CPR main line tracks. Edouard Carrière, the 24-year-old driver of the Nickel Belt Coach Line's bus, later stated that visibility was severely restricted, estimating it at little more than 10 feet in the fog-filled cold. The bus had left the Coniston smelter shortly after 8 a.m., carrying workers home from graveyard shift, picking up other residents headed to work and school along the way. Most of the passengers took their usual seats, stowed lunch pails, turned up collars, and settled into the quiet routine of a workday ending. Survivors said the vehicle was crowded, with frost-covered windows caused by the intense cold. All the seats were taken, and there were men standing in the aisle all the way to the back, said Henk van den Akker, 19. Edouard Carrière, who had driven the Coniston run for 4 months and worked for Nickel Belt Coach Lines for 18 months, described the trip as routine. It just seemed like an ordinary run, he said. However, this was not to be. What appeared to be a routine crossing proved fatally deceptive. The tracks crossed the road at a shallow angle and were flanked by snowbanks, hardened by repeated plowing. No crossing gates were installed, only standard warning signs marked the location. Trains passed frequently, and local drivers were well aware of the danger. The converging paths of bus and train were now set. The impact came without warning. The front of the bus, carrying workmen and 5 young women traveling to work in Sudbury, had already crossed the main line when the CPR Montreal to Vancouver Dominion Flyer, running behind schedule, thundered out of the frigid haze at speed, its engine pulling a long string of cars. Some passengers said they never saw the train until it struck. Others recalled hearing a horn, too late and impossibly close. The locomotive hit the bus broadside, tearing into its midsection with catastrophic force. Passengers reported hearing nothing before the collision. I was talking with Corrado Simeone when the train hit, said Henk van den Akker. We didn't hear anything before the impact. I stayed in the seat, although the bus was knocked around and turned over. Among the injured was Stella Bokorski, 20, a daily passenger on the route, who had been standing in the aisle near the driver when the impact came. A group of us get picked up each day, and this morning the bus was crowded. Suddenly I was thrown forward, and the next thing I knew, I was struggling and fighting for air. Someone pushed me forward, and I was outside. It was terrible. 17-year-old Millie Robleski, a student at St. Michael's Business College, had been seated on a bench. She remembered little beyond the chaos. Someone grabbed me and pulled me out of the window, she said. Everything was so confusing. I still don't know what happened. The force of the collision lifted and twisted the bus, hurling it from the roadway onto its left side and into the ditch between the railway right-of-way and the old Coniston Road. Windows burst outward in showers of glass, seats tore free, and bodies were thrown violently in a chaos lasting only seconds. Several men were hurled through the windows, while at least 4 others were pinned beneath the vehicle as it came to rest on its side. The wrecked bus lay crumpled beside the tracks, its frame grotesquely bent and its interior exposed to the bitter morning air. The train continued its full length before grinding to a halt. The front of the bus faced the tracks. Carlo Gabbo, a town employee standing about 80 yards from the crossing on the town side, described the scene. The bus was picked up and twirled through the air like a toy, he said. There was a blinding flash and then blackness, said Adrian Trepanier. I don't remember a thing until I awoke in this bed. The first responders were not police or ambulances, but townspeople. Residents of Coniston, alerted by the thunderous impact, rushed toward the crossing. Men left breakfast tables and work preparations. Women pulled on coats and boots, some carrying blankets. The same fog that had concealed the train now hung low over a scene of devastation. I ran to the nearest man, Gabbo continued. He was about 80 feet from the bus, covered with blood and moaning terribly. I carried him to the train. Henk van den Akker crawled toward a large opening at the rear of the bus, fearing it might ignite. I think I was the first one out of the bus, he said. There was no sign of fire, so I crawled back inside to get out the badly injured. Some of the critically injured were screaming and yelling for help. He said more men soon arrived and worked to lift the bus, which lay on its left side. The injured and dead were squeezed tight against one side. I saw 4 or 5 men caught between the seats with blood coming from their mouth and nose. A crumpled metal plate blocked the opening. I took a shovel and cut the plate. Van den Akker said a doctor treated injured men in a nearby store, which quickly became so crowded the door was difficult to open. I left the accident about 45 minutes later, he said. Others carried the injured to the train. Among the first to arrive was Reverend J. Fortin of Our Lady of Mercy Roman Catholic Church. He administered the last rites to the dead before they were removed. Moving swiftly from one to another of the injured, he spoke words of comfort and gave many a blessing. I was just putting out my ashes when I heard a great dull thud. I looked up to see the end of the bus whirled down the track through the air. A man was crawling out the window when I got there. People were screaming. Arthur Dumont, a Coniston barber, said he and bus driver Edouard Carrière, despite Carrière's own injuries, helped more than 15 people escape through a smashed rear window. We went around to the back then and smashed a window, Dumont said. A crowd had already gathered and we all helped lift the bus upright. I felt something beneath my foot in the snow. It was a man's face. He was unconscious, and then he began to scream. We carried him to the nearby train. The Coniston barber added that he then carried 2 women on his back to his barber shop, where he gave them first aid. When her mother ran to the scene of the wreck, 18-year-old Olga Belawis met her with a cry that captured the terror of the morning. "Oh, Mother, am I glad we didn't put the little children on that bus." Earlier, they had talked of sending her younger siblings to school on the bus because of the extreme cold. But the youngsters volunteered to walk to school as usual. Her father and I rushed out of the family grocery store, leaving everything as it was. We couldn't find Olga at first, and we were nearly frantic. Then we located her, covered with blood, in Arthur Dumont's barber shop, Mrs. Billiou said. The barber shop looked like a hospital, Mrs. Billiou said. People were lying everywhere. Mickey DeLongchamp, another Nickel Belt coach lines driver who arrived shortly after the crash, said between 50 and 75 men were already at the scene. We all pushed the bus up straight. There were 2 dead and 2 hurt underneath it. He said another man was badly injured, pinned between the bus and a guy wire. I hacked at the guy wire to free him. While volunteers righted the bus and attended to those trapped or wounded, some lay still, their clothes torn. Others crawled from the mangled wreckage with blood streaming from cuts. Lunch pails, gloves, and work boots littered the snow, while one rear dual wheel lay 75 feet from the bus. Survivors cried out from inside the wreckage. Others lay silent, pinned or unmoving. The bus's side had been torn open, exposing rows of seats mangled beyond recognition. Only an hour before the fatal collision, another Nickel Belt Coach Lines bus, traveling towards Sudbury at about 15 miles per hour, was struck from the rear by a truck in heavy fog, approximately 3/4 of a mile west of Coniston. William Eddy, a passenger in the truck from Coniston, suffered a cut over the eye. Provincial Police Constable Walter Coatvey, who was investigating the first accident, rushed to the scene of the subsequent collision, taking Eddy with him to assist in transporting several victims to St. Joseph's Hospital in Sudbury. Volunteers worked frantically, lifting and pulling where possible. Blood stained the snow. Some injured men were carried to nearby homes and businesses to escape the cold, while others were taken into the Coniston Radio and Fretwork store, operated by Ontario, Brett Toniolo, which was converted into a temporary morgue. 2 bodies remained in the snow beside the bus, while rescuers freed the injured. Those able to walk were escorted onto the CPR train, which remained at the scene until released by provincial police, then slowly carried many of the injured to Sudbury. The train itself suffered damage, with wheels damaged on 2 coaches and the locomotive front requiring replacement. The train crew, shaken but uninjured, assisted where they could. The train suffered damage from the collision. The locomotive front required replacement before the journey could continue. Inside the sleeper car, passengers and first aid workers converted the coach into an improvised hospital. Bloodied and broken bodies were being carefully placed in the ready-made berths, one witness said. Passengers cleared seats and berths as first aid volunteers attended the wounded. "When are we going to move?" one man cried, shortly before losing consciousness. On the train, first aiders struggled to keep the critically injured alive. One volunteer recalled helping an Inco first aid worker hold a man's head aside as blood clogged his throat. The slow ride to Sudbury was agonizing. "This is long. When are we going to get there? Doesn't this train go any faster?" one injured man asked. Another pleaded, "Am I going to die? Please don't let me die." At about 10:15 a.m., CPR employees, ambulance drivers, and first aid men waited anxiously at the Sudbury station as the passenger train arrived from Coniston, carrying 3 dead and 7 critically injured. 3 ambulances were ready along the track as the train slowed to a halt. Most of the injured, many unconscious, were in the sleeper car, where a team of Inco first aid men had been attending them en route. Crew members pried open a double window on the south side to remove the stretchers. 2 of the deceased lay in observation car number 129 at the rear, while the 3rd was in a forward car. All patients were wrapped in CPR blankets to protect them from the 30 below temperatures during transfers to ambulances, which shuttled repeatedly between Coppercliff, St. Joseph's, and Sudbury General Hospitals. "It's a good thing we got them into the heated car," one first aid man noted. A lot of men in there are in serious condition. They wouldn't last long in the cold. An eyewitness described the grim task of removing the dead. In company with ambulance drivers, I entered the death car to take out the 2 bodies after helping with the stretcher cases. Both were badly bruised about the head, blood-soaked bandages nearby, one with woolen mittens and winter cap still on. Both were in work clothes. The stretchers were placed in a hearse and removed to Ducharme's funeral home on Beach Street. Hospitals in Sudbury and Coppercliff responded immediately. Emergency departments were reinforced by on-call staff. 21 injured were taken to St. Joseph's Hospital, 9 to Sudbury General Hospital, and 2 to Coppercliff Hospital. Dr. P.E. Laflamme, who would later lead the coroner's inquest of the accident, was present in one operating room at St. Joseph's, attending the first patients as they arrived. Surgeons worked through the day and into the night, setting fractures, controlling bleeding, treating head injuries and crushed limbs. Additional beds were quickly prepared, and the plasma and blood bank opened for transfusions. The injured were brought in stretcher by stretcher, some unconscious, some walking with bleeding wounds, dazed and bewildered. Operating rooms were ready to minimize movement and prevent further injury. Priests were present to comfort victims and administer last rites, while Mother Superior Flavie Damati and a group of nuns cared for patients and companions alike, offering comfort and hot coffee. Very Rev. H.J. Humphrey, Vicar General of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Sault Ste. Marie, hurried to the Sudbury General Hospital to help with the injured. A few, miraculously, escaped with comparatively minor wounds, cuts, bruises, concussions that would heal. Donald Chabot, 18, lost fingers on his right hand and suffered multiple fractures. I was the last one to get in, only 25 feet from the crossing, and stood with my back to the rail, he said. I was on my way to work at the Imperial Bank in Sudbury. I just bent down and put my lunch pail on the floor. The next thing I knew, I was thrown forward. Then everything stopped. When I came to, I was on the train coming to Sudbury, with a man leaning over me saying, "Everything will be all right, son." It sure was quick. I never knew what hit me. Hendrik Bieliecki, 23, was placed in an oxygen tent and, according to hospital officials, is putting up a stiff fight for life. He suffered concussion, a crushed chest, a broken back, a fractured pelvis, and multiple cuts and bruises. An emergency appeal for blood donors brought 163 immediate responses. It is a wonderful thing the way these people have come forward to offer their blood for the accident victims, said Reverend Flavie Domitil of St. Joseph's Hospital. We are so grateful for the kindness of Sudbury and district residents. The response was outstanding, added Mrs. Helen McLaren of the Sudbury Red Cross. We are overwhelmed. Back on the job after a much-needed rest, Reverend Sister Joan, supervisor of the Sudbury General Hospital of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, paid tribute to the manner in which doctors, nurses, and Sudbury residents responded to the emergency following the tragedy. We have had many offers of assistance from many, many people in the city who have come forward offering blood, their services, for assistance of any kind. And for this, we are very grateful, she said. By mid-morning, the crossing was sealed off, the wreckage covered with tarps. Coniston fell silent as word spread across the district. That evening, under the dim glow of a single street lamp, the shattered bus still lay with its stubby nose near the tracks that had brought tragedy. By 7 o'clock, scores of people milled around the twisted hulk. The curious climbed inside and stood in stunned silence, gazing at scattered seats that bore grim witness to the morning's deaths. Vigil lights burned in the home of Guido Santi as the family prayed for the recovery of his brother, Antonio, who was seriously injured in the crash. 2 candles flickered before twin crosses, while relatives moved quietly through the house. Antonio Santi had suffered a crushed skull, a crushed chest, multiple fractures and abrasions, and remained in grave condition. Grief weighed heavily as well in the family of Mrs. Nello Modesto, who had taken refuge at the home of her mother, Mrs. W. Conlin. The tragedy had struck her doubly. Her uncle, Herbert Conlin, was among the dead, while her husband lay in critical condition at St. Joseph's Hospital with multiple fractures, cuts, and bruises. "He usually takes a shower and walks home," a friend recalled, but this morning he said it was too cold and was going to take the bus. Dr. C.P. Jessup, the INCO staff physician who had worked at the scene, later visited the bereaved households, administering sedatives and offering what comfort he could to families stunned by the sudden loss. Death did not come to all 9 men at once, nor in the same place. Lucien Landrial, 27, Eugene Leclan, 62, and Herbert Conlin, 58, were killed instantly in the collision, their injuries catastrophic. Alex Beauparlon, 51, Paul Charcot, 46, and Joseph Tremblay, 21, died shortly after being removed from the wreckage. Joseph Tremblay had just completed his first shift at the smelter and was returning home from the night shift when the collision occurred. He had been working in Sudbury since November, driving a taxi and doing odd jobs until securing steady employment. He was pronounced dead shortly after rescue. He was survived by his pregnant wife and a 2-year-old daughter. 3 others lingered for hours or days in hospital wards, where doctors could do little beyond easing pain. Dominic Crema, 54, died after admission to the INCO Hospital in Copper Cliff. His son, Lino, accompanied him to Sudbury on the train, said his brother, Angelo Crema, of Sudbury. "It was such a shock, he wasn't even able to give his father's name for a time." David Martin, 46, became the 8th victim when he died early Sunday morning at St. Joseph's Hospital after suffering a fractured skull, crushed chest, and severe shock. His death came after a brief return of hope. "He was unconscious when I visited the hospital earlier this afternoon," Mrs. Martin said the previous day. "But they just called a few minutes ago and said he had regained consciousness and seemed much improved." The final death occurred 4 days after the accident, when Enoch Ernie Cooper, 59, died at Sudbury General Hospital. He had fought for his life since the crash and spent several hours on the operating table Friday afternoon, suffering severe crushing injuries, serious head trauma, and acute shock. The coroner would later list causes of death that read with clinical detachment: multiple fractures, crushed chest, liver rupture, internal hemorrhage, traumatic shock. But behind each phrase stood a life interrupted, a father who did not come home, a son who never finished his shift, a husband whose seat at the supper table remained empty. A coroner's inquest was convened in Coniston, amid intense public interest and quiet anger, to examine the circumstances of the crash. Passengers and witnesses offered conflicting testimony, and the small community listened closely as each account added both clarity and contradiction. Bus driver Edward Carrier told the inquest that visibility was extremely poor and that the crossing was hazardous. "Looking east, there's a shed in the way, and often coal cars there too," he said. "You have to almost get on the tracks to see properly." "There should be a signal there," he added. "It's not a good crossing." Carrier testified, "When I stopped my bus at the crossing and opened the door, I neither saw nor heard anything of the approaching train. However, the testimony of others disputed this. He said he started forward again and had nearly crossed the tracks when the train struck. I felt my back tires across the tracks. The next thing I knew, I was flying back over the seat and landed on my back, looking at the roof of the bus. That's about all I remember of how it happened.
11-year-old Orisia Wasylenki, standing behind Carriere, said the driver was watching men pushing aboard the crowded bus as it approached the crossing. Some passengers were standing in the well near the front door, and she stated that Carriere did not look to see if the track was clear as the bus crossed. Her account was echoed by Leo Oliver, 34, who boarded at the smelter. He testified that after the final stop, a short distance from the tracks, the bus moved very slowly, 4 to 5 miles an hour, but did not stop. He was sitting directly behind the driver, and while the side windows of the bus were frosted up, preventing a view of the track, the windshield and the window to the left of the driver were clear. Carriere looked neither left nor right as we approached the track and went over without stopping.
The front door was not opened, and someone stood in the well. I had a funny feeling as we started over the tracks without stopping, Oliver said. I have been riding buses for 17 years while working at the smelter, and I always watch when I go over a crossing. As the front wheels of the bus went over the tracks, I thought to myself, I am clear. And then came the crash. Members of the train crew also testified. Locomotive fireman William Zahovich of North Bay stated that the whistle was blown in the regulation sequence, 2 long, 1 short, and a long blast, and the bell was ringing as the train entered the crossing. He said the bus was moving very slowly and did not stop as it approached. He estimated the train speed at 25 to 30 miles an hour and visibility at under 200 feet. Lionel Lafontaine, who suffered multiple injuries in the crash, testified that when the bus made its last stop, I remarked to no one in particular that there was a train coming, though I did not hear a train whistle or bell, just the sound of an engine shunting. Witness John Morose concurred. There was no whistle or bell, just the noise of an engine. Then I saw the train at the switch moving towards the crossing. Other bystanders confirmed hearing the train approaching, but said they heard no whistle or bell before the collision. Some noted sounds only at the moment of or immediately after the crash. Tony Calandino, a nearby taxi stand operator, offered similar testimony, saying, I heard an engine coming, making an awful noise, but I heard no whistle or bell. Dino Santi, waiting for the bus, saw its lights but could not tell if it was moving or stopped. He estimated visibility at from 150 to 200 feet and could not see all the bus, just the lights. He did not hear the bell on the locomotive, and the whistle which he heard he recalled as just 1 long blast. Donald Chabot told the inquest, I was the last one on the bus as we moved towards the crossing. I stepped up and handed him my ticket, and then moved over to the right, leaning on an upright just behind the well by the door. There were no passengers in the well. He added, he usually asked me if all is clear on my side, but this time he did not. But I know he looked both ways. Of the train, Chabot said simply, I heard nothing of the train. Nello Modesto testified that he tried to see if I could see the station, but I couldn't with the fog. He continued, the next thing I heard a train whistle blow, and I felt we were in a very bad spot, as I could feel we were bumping across the tracks. The whistle blew right into the crash. Anne Melnick stated, to my knowledge, the bus stopped before the crossing, though she could not say whether the door was open.
Several smelter workers traveling behind the bus in a taxi testified that it did not stop at the crossing. Mitty Pilat stated, "I stopped when the bus did at 5th Street, and then went along behind him as we approached the crossing. The bus was going only 3 or 4 miles an hour. When I saw that he was not slowing down for the crossing, I took a look to see if anything was coming, and I saw the train. By that time, the bus was on the crossing and going over. He had been traveling at a very slow rate of speed, but he did not stop as he came up to the tracks. I was from 50 to 75 feet from the crossing when I saw the train, and it was from 50 to 75 feet from the bus." Pilat added that he did not hear any whistle or bell before the crash.
Frank Pilkington, a passenger in the taxi, corroborated that no whistle or bell was heard. He further testified that the red lights at the rear of the bus illuminated each time it stopped to pick up or discharge passengers, but from the time it pulled away at 5th Street, the red lights did not go on, indicating to him that the bus did not stop before reaching the tracks.
Gerard Pellerin, a smelter worker from Minnow Lake, who was aboard the bus that morning, testified, "I remember that it did not stop at the crossing. He said he heard no train whistle or bell and was rendered unconscious in the collision." The 6-man coroner's jury concluded that neither bus driver, Edouard Carrier, nor Canadian Pacific Railway engineer Daniel F. Dowdall had taken the necessary precautions under the severe weather conditions of February 9th. Reading the verdict, jury foreman Verdell Price stated, "From the conflicting evidence, it would appear that on account of the extraordinary weather conditions that morning, the extra precautions necessary were not taken or observed by the driver of the bus or the engineer of the train." The legal story, however, was far from over.
At her home, Mrs. Herbert Conlon, left widowed with 11 children, spoke with quiet indignation about the crossing where her husband lost his life. She placed blame not only on circumstance, but on the absence of warning safeguards. "This wouldn't have happened if there had been a wigwag on the crossing," she said. "Bobby, our 18-year-old son, was almost killed there because there was no signal. A train missed the car in which he was riding by inches. It is a terrible thing, and something should be done about it." 19-year-old Henk Vandenacker, who escaped the wreck with only minor injury, returned to work the very night of the crash, a decision that surprised many who knew what he had endured only hours earlier. "I was the only man on our shift at the pilot mill to report back for work Friday night after the accident," he said. "About 8 men on our shift were hurt. Our shift boss, Lucien Landriot, was killed. I helped carry out the assistant shift boss, Nello Modesto. He was badly hurt." He added that their section of the mill could not operate normally. "Our section of the pilot mill couldn't operate on the night shift because most of the experienced men were dead or in hospital." The funerals of the victims were held over several days and drew crowds that filled churches beyond capacity. In Coniston, Sudbury, and Sturgeon Falls, black-coated mourners gathered beneath winter skies to pay their final respects. A mass funeral for 4 of the men, Eugene Leclerc, Herbert Conlon, Alex Beauparlant, and Primo Crema, was held at Our Lady of Mercy Roman Catholic Church in Coniston, where hundreds crowded the building and overflowed its entrance. Beginning Sunday evening, mourners filled the church to view the bodies as Father Fortin led the rosary. A wake continued throughout the night, with the bodies lying in state. Flags flew at half-mast throughout the community, and many smelter workers missed their shifts to attend the services. The front of the church was banked with floral tributes from relatives and friends. Mayor Roy Snitch represented the town of Coniston, accompanied by several members of council. The first low mass was scheduled for 9:30 a.m. Monday, though the church filled long before that hour.
By the time the solemn high mass began shortly after 10 a.m., the steps and entrance were crowded, with additional mourners standing outside. The masses were celebrated by Reverend J. Forten and Reverend J. H. Bruneau, parish priest of Our Lady of Mercy Church, assisted by Very Reverend J. C. Humphrey and Reverend J. Hickey of the Church of Christ the King in Sudbury, and Monsignor J. H. Collier of St. John de Brebeuf Church in Sudbury. Mr. Beauparlant was buried at St. Charles, while the remaining 3 were interred in the Sudbury Roman Catholic Cemetery. That same day, funeral services for Paul Charcot were held at the Jackson and Barnard Funeral Home Chapel, officiated by Reverend James Terry of St. Andrew's United Church, Sudbury. Services for Joseph Tremblay were conducted at Ducharme's Funeral Home in Sudbury, with Reverend F. F. Knock of the Church of the Epiphany officiating. Interment followed at Park Lawn Cemetery. Meanwhile, Sacred Heart Church in Sturgeon Falls was crowded with relatives and friends, who paid final tribute to former resident Lucien Landriel. 2 days later, services for David Martin were held at St. Andrew's United Church in Coniston, followed by internment at Park Lawn Cemetery. That evening, a service for Enoch Ernie Cooper was conducted at the Jackson and Barnard Funeral Home Chapel on Larch Street, with Reverend J. S. Rowe of Knox Presbyterian Church officiating. His remains were later taken to Girard, Ohio, for burial. In the weeks that followed, legal scrutiny sharpened. Bus driver Edouard Carrière was charged with manslaughter, the indictment relating specifically to the death of Herbert Conlon, one of the victims of the crash. The charge sparked debate throughout the region, with some viewing it as necessary accountability and others as an unfair burden placed upon a single man amid broader failures. Magistrate W. F. Woodliff went to his home and remanded him for a week on a $3,000 bail. The charge was laid by International Nickel Company Police, in whose jurisdiction the accident occurred. Laying of the charge does not necessarily mean the driver was negligent, Chief Constable Runciman said. However, there has been sufficient evidence to warrant laying the charge.
Nickel Belt Coach Lines provided bail for Carrier and publicly stated that it attached no blame to the driver, maintaining that he had taken all reasonable precautions at the crossing. After recovering from injuries suffered in the collision, Carrier was reinstated by the company and resumed driving, though he was not returned to the Coniston route. The trial was held on January 8, 1952, 11 months after the tragedy. 8 Crown witnesses testified, and the court again examined the fog, speed, visibility, and statutory obligations that marked the morning of the crash. Both prosecution and defense scrutinized seconds, distances, and human perception under severe winter conditions. Carrier maintained that he had stopped at the crossing and neither saw nor heard the approaching train. He was ultimately acquitted of criminal responsibility. The verdict brought legal closure to the criminal proceedings, though it satisfied few completely. Civil litigation followed a different course. Families of the deceased launched actions seeking damages for lost income, companionship, and support. In calmer proceedings, the courts assessed liability, and settlements were reached totaling more than $200,000. In 2 early settlements, the families of Lucien Landrial and Alex Beauparlant received a combined $29,250 from Nickel Belt Coach Lines. Shortly afterward, settlements totaling $35,000 were announced for the families of Herbert Conlon and David Martin, leaving 36 claims still unresolved. While substantial for the time, the awards could not restore what had been lost. The lawsuits underscored the economic consequences of the tragedy and the lives permanently altered in its wake. 75 years on. Well, dear readers, the Coniston Rail Crossing stands today as it did on that bitter February morning in 1951, as a place where ordinary routine met irreversible loss.
9 men left work and did not return, while dozens more carried injuries into the years that followed. Though time has softened the sharpest edges of that day, it has not erased them. The memory of 9 men lost endures, and tragedy often share the same road. What happened was not a single failure, but a convergence of weather, infrastructure, judgment, and fate. To remember it is not merely to recount sorrow, but to honor lives lived, interrupted but not forgotten. And in that remembering, the dead are given what history can still offer them: a name, a place, and the dignity of being recalled.